The red wine soaked into my collar in a ballroom full of equity partners who o'clock. That family had no idea the woman they just humiliated held the final approval over their $2.4 billion acquisition. But the spilled drink did not destroy them. It was the frantic cover-up they launched seconds later, turning every buried secret into the exact evidence that burned their empire to the ground. I am Harper Flores. I am 39 years old, and I am the Chief Transaction Integrity Officer at Bramwell Thorne Capital. Tonight, I stood in the glittering, claustrophobic heart of a pre-signing gala in Charlotte. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel smelled of expensive oud, roasted duck, and the sharp metallic tang of old money desperation. We were here to celebrate a $2.4 billion acquisition. A sprawling logistics empire belonging to the Veale family was positioned to swallow a rapidly growing Southern transport technology network. For the Veales, this was not just a routine corporate merger. It was a desperate, gilded lifeline. It was the absolute final move left on the board to save their bleeding stock price and cement the fractured grip of their chief executive officer, Adrian Veale. The vintage champagne flowed. The string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Everyone wore the polished, impenetrable armor of American corporate high society. Then there was Celeste Veale. Adrian's younger sister held no official executive title on the corporate masthead. On paper, she was merely the face of the brand, the chair of the Philanthropic Image Committee, and a primary beneficiary of the generation-spanning family trust. In reality, she wielded absolute, unchecked authority. In the Veale ecosystem, printed titles meant nothing, blood meant everything. The financial market might look at Adrian when the opening bell rang, but the people in this room always looked at Celeste. She wore a backless emerald gown that commanded immediate submission, holding court near a towering ice sculpture of the company logo. From the exact moment I arrived at the venue, Celeste made a deliberate sport of diminishing me. It was executed with a lethal, flawlessly manicured politeness. Early in the evening, she introduced me to a group of mezzanine financiers as the firm's operations support. When a waiter passed by our circle with a heavy silver tray of empty glasses, she looked at me with a perfectly weaponized smile. "Harper, would you mind grabbing a napkin for me?" "My hands are terribly sticky," she said. She did not wait for an answer. She simply turned her back to me, resuming her conversation, assuming absolute compliance. Later, near the sprawling raw bar, she loudly thanked me for managing the back-office logistics of the transaction paperwork. Every jab was surgically calculated. Every spoken word was designed to carve me down, to put me securely in a subservient place. In her narrative, I was merely the hired help, tolerated in this ballroom only because the strict legal bureaucracy required my physical presence. I caught Adrian's eye across the room during one of these exchanges. He was nursing a neat scotch, standing shoulder to shoulder with the senior buyout partners. He saw all of it. He witnessed the napkin request. He heard the degrading introductions. He saw his younger sister treating a senior executive from their lead capital source like an unpaid intern. He did absolutely nothing. He simply looked away, taking a slow sip of his drink. That silence was a masterclass in toxic family dynamics. In the grand house of Veale, Celeste drew blood for sport, and the rest of the family simply handed her the towel. She was completely immune to the concept of consequences. The evening wore on, drifting relentlessly toward the 2-hour mark. The heavy hitters of the deal began to converge. A powerful cluster of limited partners and the managing directors from our 2 lead lending institutions moved deliberately toward the center of the ballroom. Celeste immediately sensed an audience. She drifted over to the group, her heavy crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux held loosely in one hand. She positioned herself directly in front of me, physically forcing the partners and lenders to form a tight, expectant ring around us. "So, Harper," Celeste said. Her voice projected just loud enough to cut sharply through the ambient jazz and polite chatter of the room. "Tell us about the wiring schedule for tomorrow morning. I want to make sure the operational side has its act together before the press release hits at exactly 8 o'clock. She was testing me in front of the Capitol. She was interrogating me like a junior associate who might have misplaced a critical file. The lenders watched silently. The limited partners waited, their expressions neutral but their eyes sharp. The air inside our circle grew incredibly thin. I looked directly at her. I kept my face entirely blank, locking my posture into a stance of absolute professional stillness. I did not raise my voice. I did not shift my weight. I delivered the reality of the situation. "The capital disbursement is firmly scheduled for 7 in the morning," I said. "However, the funds will only clear if all conditions regarding corporate conduct, compliance, and public disclosure remain fully intact through the night. The integrity certification is the final gate. Without it, the wiring schedule is entirely irrelevant." The temperature inside the circle dropped to freezing. The lead lenders blinked, instantly recognizing the specific, devastating legal weight of my vocabulary. Celeste's flawless smile fractured at the edges. The muscles in her jaw tightened visibly beneath her heavy makeup. She suddenly understood, right then and there, that I was not a floral decoration. I was not an administrative assistant. I was the one woman standing in this room with her hand resting directly on the throat of their $2.4 billion survival plan. For a fraction of a second, the carefully curated public mask slipped. Pure, unadulterated entitlement flashed violently in her dark eyes. She hated being publicly reminded that she needed outside permission to survive. She hated being reminded that someone outside her aristocratic bloodline held the heavy end of the leash. Celeste stepped one half-pace closer. She tilted her chin up, reclaiming her plastic, camera-ready smile. "Standards matter," she said, with a fluid, deliberate, and violent flick of her wrist. She threw the entire contents of her glass directly at my chest. The dark red wine hit the crisp white silk of my tailored suit with a heavy, wet slap. It splattered violently across my lapels, immediately soaking through the expensive fabric. It dripped down my torso in thick, jagged crimson lines, pooling at the edge of my tailored jacket. The string quartet kept playing their bright tempo, but the immediate vicinity around us went dead silent. The conversation died in the throats of the men standing near us. Dozens of eyes locked onto my ruined suit. I heard the sharp, involuntary intake of breath from a senior lender standing immediately to my left. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the distinct, glowing rectangular screen of a smartphone hovering over someone's shoulder. The high-definition camera lens pointed squarely at us, recording every frame of the humiliation. The wine felt cold and heavy against my skin. This specific brand of humiliation was designed by generations of cruelty to be completely paralyzing. It was designed to shatter my composure, to make me scream, to make me cry, or to force me to run out of the ballroom in unbearable shame. I stood perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not raise my hands to wipe at the spreading stain. I kept my breathing even and shallow. I looked right past Celeste's triumphant face and searched the crowd. I found Adrian Veale. He stood exactly 30 feet away. He had a clear, unobstructed view. He saw his sister assault a senior officer of his primary capital provider in front of the people writing the checks. He saw the dark red stain expanding rapidly on my clothes. He saw the lenders staring in absolute paralyzed shock. He did not rush forward to intervene. He did not raise his voice to reprimand her. He did not cross the floor to offer me a linen towel or a desperate apology. He simply stood there, frozen like a statue, his eyes darting around the room as he calculated the immediate social optics. Beside him, standing near a marble pillar, their mother Lenora watched the entire spectacle with a look of detached, aristocratic amusement. Not a single member of the Veale family moved to stop it, to correct it, or to apologize for it. That collective, sickening paralysis was the true revelation of the night. It was the precise moment the foundation of their empire cracked open for everyone to see. It was not just a spoiled, wealthy heiress throwing a temporary tantrum. It was a deeply ingrained, systemic corporate rot. The silence of the Veale family was their ultimate signature. It was the exact moment the captive audience in that room, and the critical lenders standing rigidly beside me, realized this was not a simple social mistake. It was a terrifying, unvarnished glimpse into a corporate governance structure that had completely lost its grip on reality. They were a family that truly believed they could buy the world and publicly abuse everyone in it without ever having to pay the bill. My office at Bramwell Thorne Capital sits on the 42nd floor, a silent, glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the sprawling concrete grid of Manhattan. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, roughly 5 hours before I would step onto the carpet of that Charlotte ballroom, my heavy oak desk was completely buried. Stacks of final closing documents, legal opinions, and disclosure schedules for the Veale acquisition formed neat, imposing towers. Celeste Veale would later try to brand me as a low-level event coordinator, a glorified administrative assistant tasked with fetching napkins and managing the catering timeline. The reality of institutional finance is infinitely colder and far more structural. I am not the hired help. I am the gatekeeper. In a syndicated corporate buyout of this immense scale, pulling together $2.4 billion requires an intricate, highly fragile web of capital. We were utilizing senior debt from 2 major global banks, a layer of mezzanine financing from a specialized credit fund, and a massive equity check from our own private equity reserves. By 3:15 that afternoon, the money was fully syndicated. The actual cash was sitting in highly secure escrow accounts, idling like a massive, dormant engine waiting to be dropped into gear. The asset purchase agreements were fully executed by the lawyers. The regulatory hurdles from the antitrust division were cleared. The victorious press releases were already drafted, approved, and scheduled to hit the global financial wires at precisely 8 o'clock the following morning. But none of that momentum mattered. None of those signatures meant anything without the final key turning in the lock. The entire mechanical structure of the deal hinged on a single, deeply buried closing condition. It was called the integrity certification, and it was my sole responsibility to execute it before a single dollar of that $2.4 billion could cross the electronic wire. The lead lenders required a sworn, legally binding guarantee from Bramwell Thorne Capital. They needed absolute assurance that the target company and its executive principals were completely free of undisclosed financial liabilities, pending hostile litigation, or active reputational risks that could destroy the value of the newly merged entity. It is a strictly binary switch. If the target company operates cleanly and transparently, I sign the certification, and the banking syndicate releases the floodgates of capital at dawn. If, however, I detect a material risk, an anomaly in corporate behavior, or a deliberate failure to disclose a structural flaw, I do not sign. Instead, my mandate requires me to trigger a conduct review hold. This specific contractual clause was not born out of executive paranoia or some personal vendetta against the target company. It is a mathematical, highly calibrated safeguard. It was drafted specifically to protect our limited partners, the pension funds, the university endowments, the sovereign wealth managers from pouring billions of dollars into an unstable corporate governance structure. A company rotting from the inside, guided by erratic leadership, will eventually collapse under its own weight, dragging our capital down into the wreckage. I was the one who had personally insisted on drafting the conduct review hold directly into the primary credit agreement 6 months ago. During the initial, grueling due diligence phase of the Veale transaction, I started noticing strange, unsettling anomalies in their corporate ecosystem. The logistics company was publicly traded, but it was operated like a feudal monarchy. Celeste Veale kept appearing in the margins of highly restricted governance documents, where she had absolutely no legal or operational right to be. She was not an elected member of the board of directors. She was not a named executive officer with fiduciary duties, yet her sprawling signature authorized massive, multi-million-dollar discretionary spending accounts. Her name was inexplicably copied on highly sensitive, confidential human resources settlements involving senior management. She was operating as a shadow executive, wielding massive structural power across the entire organization with absolutely zero legal accountability to the shareholders. That kind of uncontained, off-the-books influence is a massive red flag in the world of institutional investing. It screams of a systemic lack of internal controls. At 4 o'clock, the heavy glass door of my office swung open. Miles Corbett, the chief legal counsel for Bramwell Thorne Capital, walked in carrying a thick, red-tagged manila folder. Miles was a 30-year veteran of corporate warfare, a man who viewed the world entirely through the lens of risk probabilities and legal exposure. He dropped the heavy folder squarely on the center of my desk and pointed a long finger at the blank integrity certification waiting patiently for my pen. "The lenders are getting extremely anxious, Harper," Miles said, leaning his weight against the edge of my desk. "The lead syndicate desk in London called me twice in the last hour. They want to make sure the certification is ready to execute tonight before the market closes over there. They are holding $2.4 billion in liquid cash, and it is costing them a small fortune in institutional carrying costs every single hour it sits parked in escrow." I did not look up from the complex compliance addendum I was currently auditing. "They can wait until the ink is completely dry on every single item on the closing checklist," I replied, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "The terms of the credit agreement clearly state the integrity certification is the absolute final item to be executed. I need to observe the principles in a live, unscripted environment tonight before I put my name on that document." Miles crossed his arms across his chest, his expression sobering into a mask of grim professionalism. "Just remember the absolute mechanics of the clause you drafted," Miles said, his voice dropping an octave. "If you refuse to sign a clean certification tonight, the entire funding apparatus automatically defaults to a hard freeze. The transaction goes immediately into a mandatory review hold. We are not just delaying the wire transfer by a few days. We are forcing a complete, forensic deep dive into the Veale's entire corporate history for the past 36 months. Everything gets ripped open. Every email, every suppressed complaint, every quiet settlement. It will be bloody Harper, and the Veales will fight like cornered animals. If they are operating a clean ship, they have absolutely nothing to worry about," I said, finally looking up from the paperwork to meet his intense gaze. "Just be 100% sure," Miles warned, his tone low and deadly serious. "You have the absolute contractual authority to stop this moving train, but if you pull that emergency brake, you better have a mountain of documented, irrefutable cause. The Veale family will not take a capital delay quietly. They will use every ounce of political and financial leverage they possess to destroy whoever stands in their way." I understood Miles perfectly. He was not trying to intimidate me. He was preparing me for the blast radius. My authority within Bramwell Thorne did not stem from social leverage, family lineage, or popularity contests. It did not matter if the Veale family liked me, respected me, or even understood my actual job title. My power resided entirely in the cold, hard legality of my signature. In the ruthless ecosystem of high finance, a legally binding signature is the only currency that actually matters. No amount of screaming, threatening, public posturing, or high society intimidation could force the global banking syndicate to release those funds without my explicit, written authorization. Before I finally left the office to pack my overnight bag for the short flight down to Charlotte, I ran one final, exhaustive audit of the secure data room. I checked the updated disclosure schedules. I reviewed the pending litigation logs for any last-minute filings. I scrubbed the executive communication records one last time. On paper, the Veale organization looked like a perfectly functioning, highly profitable corporate machine, but I knew from decades of experience that paper could be sanitized. Paper could be aggressively manipulated by armies of expensive defense lawyers and highly paid public relations teams. That is exactly why the pre-signing gala existed. It was not a celebration of a deal well done. It was a calculated stress test. It was my final, critical opportunity to observe the actual human beings who would be managing our $2.4 billion investment. I needed to see how Adrian Veale operated under the crushing pressure of the finish line. I needed to see how the extended family interacted with the powerful lenders who literally held their corporate survival in their hands. Most importantly, I needed to see if the shadow authority I had sensed lurking in the governance documents, the unchecked, erratic, and deeply entitled influence of Celeste Veale would manifest in the real world when she thought she was untouchable. I locked my computer terminal, picked up my leather briefcase, and headed for the elevator bank. I knew exactly what was at stake. If anything deviated from standard, ethical corporate protocol tonight, if I witnessed any behavior that indicated a failure of governance or a material risk to our capital structure, I would have to execute my duty. I would have to pull the plug, knowing full well it would ignite a massive corporate war with one of the most powerful and ruthless families in the American logistics industry. When I boarded the private jet to Charlotte, I carried the massive weight of that responsibility in total silence. I was not walking into that luxury ballroom as a guest or a spectator. I was walking in as the final safety mechanism of a multi-billion-dollar machine. The Veales thought they were completely untouchable because they had built a generational fortress of wealth, arrogance, and intimidation. They did not realize that the very financial contract designed to save their crumbling empire had a fatal self-destruct sequence built right into its core, and I was the only person in the world holding the final authorization. The fractures in the Veale empire did not suddenly appear on the night of the gala. They had been crawling up the load-bearing walls for months, hidden behind expensive public relations campaigns and aggressive legal posturing. During the rigorous 90 days of preliminary due diligence, I spent hundreds of hours dissecting their corporate anatomy. From the outside, the logistics firm was a modern, publicly traded powerhouse. From the inside, it operated like a deeply dysfunctional feudal state. The most glaring anomaly was always Celeste. By the second month of our negotiations, it became terrifyingly clear that she was treating a multi-billion-dollar public entity as her own personal sandbox. She possessed no executive title, yet her fingerprints were smeared across every critical operational document. I watched her hijack a crucial quarterly strategy call with institutional investors, talking over the actual chief financial officer to dictate market positioning. She routinely bypassed the legal department to force unauthorized edits onto confidential investor prospectuses. She acted exactly like a shadow chief executive officer, and the actual leadership simply stepped aside to let her pass. Adrian Veale, the man whose signature was supposed to command the entire enterprise, never once put a stop to it. In the corporate world, weakness at the top is a contagion. Adrian practiced a cowardly policy of appeasement. Whenever Celeste overstepped her non-existent authority, Adrian would soften his voice, smile nervously, and tell his executive team to accommodate her vision. He ran a massive public company exactly the way his family ran their private dining room, avoiding conflict at all costs to keep the peace. That toxic dynamic flowed directly down from the matriarch. Lenora Veale had officially stepped down as chairwoman 5 years prior, but she still ruled the board of directors from the shaded patio of her country club. Lenora viewed the public shareholders as a necessary nuisance. To her, the company was not a fiduciary responsibility, it was an extension of the Veale bloodline. She openly referred to Celeste as the true face of the family. Anyone who demanded standard corporate compliance or dared to push back against Celeste's whims was quietly branded by Lenora as lacking class, lacking vision, or simply being too small-minded to understand their aristocratic way of doing business. But arrogance alone does not kill a merger. Fraud does. And I had been hunting for the exact line where their entitlement crossed into liability. My battleground was the digital data room, a highly encrypted server holding hundreds of thousands of corporate records. 3 weeks before the gala, I was running a late-night forensic sweep of their operational ledgers when I found the first jagged piece of the puzzle. It was a massive, decentralized expenditure buried deep within the marketing budget. A flat fee of $3.5 million had been wired to a completely opaque third-party brand consulting firm. There was no request for proposal. There was no competitive bidding process. There were absolutely no documented deliverables attached to the invoice. The authorization signature at the bottom of the wire transfer request belonged to Celeste Veale. I kept digging. I cross-referenced the dates of that suspicious wire transfer with their internal human resources logs. That was when I found the 2 ghost files. Deep within the restricted employee retention database, Two senior female executives had their employment terminated abruptly within a 6-month window. Both women had immaculate performance reviews right up until their final day. Their exit files contained no standard severance paperwork. Instead, both files bore a stark, red-lettered watermark that simply read, "Resolved privately." There was no explanation, no legal waiver attached, and absolutely no disclosure of the capital used to make whatever the problem was go away. When a public company uses the phrase "resolved privately" regarding senior staff departures, it is almost always code for a systemic, highly damaging internal cover-up. Celeste knew I was circling the truth. She could feel the compliance net tightening around her informal empire. 2 weeks before the gala, she ambushed me in a glass-walled conference room after a grueling session on risk allocation. She dismissed the junior lawyers with a wave of her hand and sat directly across from me. She slid a printed draft of the final public disclosure schedule across the mahogany table. "Harper, I have been reviewing the risk language your team drafted regarding our internal governance structure," Celeste said, tapping her manicured fingernail against the paper. "It feels incredibly hostile. It reads like an indictment. Can we not find a more elegant, streamlined way to phrase this? We want our new partners to feel confident, not terrified." She was smiling, but her eyes were cold and perfectly flat. She was trying to leverage her social gravity to force me into altering a legally binding federal disclosure. "The language is strictly standardized," I replied, refusing to touch the paper. "It accurately reflects the current operational reality of the board and the executive committee. Elegant language that obscures material facts is considered misrepresentation. We do not do that at Bramwell Thorne." Her smile hardened into a rigid line. "You lack imagination. Harper, everything can be finessed. Everything," she said. She left the room without another word. But the atmosphere inside the deal completely soured after that afternoon. The paranoia within their ranks became palpable. Just 4 days before we all flew to Charlotte, the executive assistant who managed the private schedules for the entire Veale family abruptly resigned. She did not give 2 weeks of notice. She did not transition her files. She simply left her security badge on her desk, walked out of the corporate headquarters, and disconnected her phone. In my line of work, when the person who manages the calendars and the shredded documents suddenly runs for the exits right before a massive financial audit closes, it means they know the building is going to burn and they refuse to be trapped inside. I had the pieces. I had the suspicious $3.5 million wire transfer. I had the 2 suppressed human resources files. I had the sudden disappearance of the family assistant. I had the undeniable reality of a shadow executive subverting the legal authority of the chief executive officer, but in the rigid, hyper-legal world of institutional finance, having the pieces is not enough. You need the glue. Suspicions, behavioral anomalies, and encrypted rumors cannot legally justify freezing a $2.4 billion transaction. If I had pulled the conduct hold based solely on those files, Adrian Veale's defense lawyers would have buried me in injunctions. They would have claimed the payments were legitimate oversights and the HR files were standard confidential severances. They would have painted me as an aggressive, paranoid auditor trying to sabotage a historic merger over clerical technicalities. I needed something undeniable. I needed a public, catastrophic failure of their governance structure. I needed them to prove, in front of the people writing the checks, that their toxic internal culture was a direct threat to our capital. I walked into that ballroom knowing the foundation of their company was already cracked. I just did not yet have the authority to expose it. Then, Celeste Veale smiled, raised her glass, and gave me the proof I needed. The red wine dripped from the hem of my jacket, staining the white marble floor of the ballroom. A single drop hit the stone with a soft, wet tap. In the heavy, suffocating silence of that circle, it sounded like a gavel striking wood. Celeste stood there, her chin tilted upward in an arrogant posture of victory, waiting for my reaction. She was waiting for the tears, the screaming, or the desperate slap across her face. She wanted a reality television moment. She wanted me to lose my mind so she could play the victim of an unstable, hysterical woman, I gave her absolutely nothing. I did not raise my hand. I did not speak a single word. I locked my eyes onto hers for exactly 3 seconds, registering the smug satisfaction dancing in her pupils. Then, I simply turned on my heel and walked away. My strides were measured, calm, and completely unhurried. I left her standing there with her empty glass, surrounded by the paralyzed lenders and her silently complicit family. Let them believe they had won. Let them revel in the temporary, intoxicating high of their public dominance. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom closed behind me, cutting off the bright sounds of the string quartet. The corridor outside was empty, lined with thick carpets and gilded mirrors. I did not head for the restrooms to desperately scrub at the stain. I did not run to my hotel suite to hide. I reached into the pocket of my ruined blazer and pulled out my phone. My fingers moved rapidly across the illuminated screen, entirely steady, bypassing personal contacts and opening the secure corporate legal portal. I opened a new encrypted message addressed directly to Miles Corbett and the senior managing directors at the London and New York syndicate desks. I did not write an emotional paragraph about what had just occurred. The system does not care about feelings. The system only responds to specific, pre-programmed legal triggers. I typed 3 short, devastating sentences. Material conduct breach observed at the pre-signing event. Integrity. Certification is hereby withheld. I am officially activating the conduct trigger review hold on the Veale transaction, effective immediately. I hit send. It was exactly 9:42 in the evening. There was no need to consult with Adrian Veale. There was no requirement to seek permission from the board of directors. The beauty of a pre-installed compliance mechanism is its ruthless, automated efficiency. The moment that email left my outbox, a massive, invisible machinery roared to life. Automated alerts instantly bypassed the standard corporate firewalls. Urgent red flag notifications populated the inboxes of over 40 senior transaction lawyers, compliance officers, and investment committee members spread across 3 different time zones. The banking software automatically intercepted the pending wire instructions scheduled for 7 o'clock the following morning. The $2.4 billion, which had been sitting on the very edge of release, was instantly locked in place. Back inside the ballroom, Celeste was undoubtedly holding court, laughing softly with her sycophants, completely oblivious to the fact that the very air was being sucked out of her family's empire. She thought she had just survived a minor social drama that could be smoothed over with a hollow apology and a fresh bottle of champagne. She possessed absolutely no understanding of corporate physics. From the exact millisecond that wine left her glass, the event had ceased to be a social faux pas. It had instantly mutated into a documented conduct risk, permanently logged into the federal transaction record. Exactly 6 minutes after I sent the email, my phone vibrated in my palm. The caller identification displayed Adrian Veale's private number. The automated system had done its job. The lead counsel for the banking syndicate had just forwarded my hold notice directly to Adrian's executive inbox. I answered the call on the second ring, pressing the phone to my ear as I walked slowly toward the bank of elevators. "Harper, what exactly is going on?" Adrian asked. His voice was incredibly tight. He was trying desperately to maintain the smooth, commanding baritone of a chief executive officer, but the raw, unadulterated panic vibrating underneath his words was unmistakable. "My legal team just received an automated system alert saying the wire transfer for tomorrow morning has been suspended. The system says you triggered a conduct hold. Tell me this is some kind of clerical error." "There is no error, Adrian," I replied, my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of sympathy. "The integrity certification requires my signature confirming the sound operational conduct of the target company and its principals. I cannot provide that signature." "Over a spilled drink," he hissed, his volume rising just enough to betray his absolute desperation. "Are you out of your mind?" My sister made a clumsy mistake. She had too much to drink. She tripped, and she made a fool of herself. "We will replace your suit. We will send a formal apology letter. But you cannot freeze a multi-billion-dollar acquisition over a spilled drink. I need you to come up to my private suite right now. We are going to sit down. We are going to talk about this privately, and we are going to fix it before the London markets open. There is no private talk, I stated cleanly, cutting right through his frantic negotiation. The incident did not happen in private. The assault occurred in the direct physical presence of the lead mezzanine financiers and the primary senior debt providers. They watched your sister intentionally weaponize her behavior, and they watched you stand by and tacitly endorse it. You cannot negotiate your way out of a systemic governance failure in a hotel room. The hold remains active. Expect the formal review parameters from our legal department by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I disconnected the call before he could utter another word. I did not want to hear his excuses. I did not want to hear his empty promises. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The transaction was dead in the water, and the Veales were officially bleeding out. But the most beautiful, satisfying element of a modern corporate execution is that you rarely have to swing the sword yourself. If you simply give arrogant people enough room to expose themselves, they will do the rest. At 11:15 that same night, while I was sitting quietly in the back of a black car heading toward the airport to fly back to New York, my phone illuminated with a new message. It was a screenshot sent by a junior analyst on my team who followed the high society social media circuits. It was a photograph posted directly to Celeste Veale's public social media account just minutes ago. The image was a stylized, artistic shot of a half-empty glass of red wine resting on the edge of a marble table in the ballroom. There was no caption. There was only a single, brightly colored text overlay placed directly across the center of the image. It read, "Standards matter." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face in the darkness of the car. Celeste could not help herself. Her ego was a black hole that demanded constant, public feeding. She was so intoxicated by her own perceived invincibility that she felt the absolute need to take a victory lap. She thought she was mocking me to her thousands of wealthy followers. She did not realize she had just handed me the final, indestructible piece of legal ammunition I needed. If Adrian had decided to fight the conduct hold in federal court, his high-priced defense attorneys would have undoubtedly argued that the incident in the ballroom was an unfortunate, unintentional accident. They would have claimed Celeste lost her balance, that her hand slipped, that it was a tragedy of physics rather than a malicious assault. They would have tried to paint my response as an aggressive, paranoid overreaction to a simple social mistake, but this photograph completely incinerated that defense. By posting that specific phrase, the exact same 3 words she spoke right before she threw the wine, Celeste had publicly, permanently documented her own malicious intent. It was absolute proof of premeditation. It proved the act was a deliberate, calculated humiliation, and more importantly, it proved she felt absolutely zero remorse about jeopardizing her publicly traded company to settle a personal vendetta. It was a signed confession wrapped in a digital boast. I forwarded the screenshot directly to Miles Corbett with a single line of text, "Add this to the permanent investigative file." I leaned my head back against the cool leather seat of the car and watched the city lights blur past the window. The adrenaline was slowly fading, replaced by a deep, profound sense of professional satisfaction. I had not won this battle by losing my temper. I had not won by engaging in a screaming match in the middle of a crowded room. I had won by stepping back, engaging the cold machinery of the financial system, and allowing the Veale family to methodically document their own destruction. Every desperate phone call, every arrogant post, every attempt to minimize the damage was simply another nail driven deeply into the coffin of their $2.4 billion dream. The sun had barely broken over the Manhattan skyline the following morning when the first retaliatory strike landed in my secure inbox. It was exactly 6:30 in the morning. The document was not drafted by the corporate merger specialists we had been negotiating with for months. It was a formal, aggressively worded cease and desist letter dispatched directly by the Veale family's ferocious private litigation counsel. They were the kind of high-priced attack dogs retained exclusively by the ultra-wealthy to crush dissidents and silence journalists. The letter was a masterpiece of legal fiction. It explicitly accused me of acting with malicious, tortious intent. It claimed I was weaponizing a minor, unfortunate social misunderstanding to intentionally sabotage a $2.4 billion transaction. Their fabricated theory was that I was attempting to hold the merger hostage in order to extort a highly compensated executive seat on the newly formed board of directors. It was a classic, ruthless intimidation tactic. In their world, if you cannot control the auditor, you immediately accuse the auditor of corruption before the investigation can even begin. They wanted me terrified of a personal defamation lawsuit. They wanted me to quietly withdraw the hold to save my own career. I forwarded the threat directly to Miles Corbett without a single word of commentary and poured my first cup of coffee. My desk phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. The caller identification flashed with Adrian Veale's name. The frantic, unvarnished panic he displayed the night before had vanished entirely, replaced by a smooth, heavily practiced executive diplomacy. "Harper, let us hit the reset button," Adrian said. His voice was pitched low, attempting to project a sense of shared, weary camaraderie. "I took the company jet to New York. I am sitting in a town car 3 blocks from your building. Let me buy you a cup of coffee. No lawyers. No legal posturing, just the two of us figuring out a sensible path forward." "The compliance hold is an active legal mechanism, Adrian," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly sterile. "Any communication regarding the status of the transaction must be formally routed through Miles Corbett and the Syndicate Counsel on a recorded line." "I am offering an olive branch," Adrian pressed, his artificial warmth hardening just slightly at the edges. "Celeste is completely mortified. She is ready to sit down with you, face to face, in a strictly private setting, and issue a full, unreserved apology. We can draw up a standard non-disclosure agreement, smooth over the hurt feelings, and you can lift the hold before the lenders start asking too many unnecessary questions and spooking the market." He still did not understand the machinery he was dealing with. He truly believed corporate compliance was just a high-stakes emotional negotiation. A private apology in a closed room does not cure a public breach of conduct, I told him, enunciating every single word so there could be no misinterpretation. "The assault occurred in the direct physical presence of your primary debt providers. They watched your sister intentionally violate basic operational protocols, and they watched your entire executive team silently endorse it. I cannot certify your governance structure based on a secret, legally suppressed apology. The hold remains firmly in place." I disconnected the line. I knew exactly what would happen next. When the direct approach fails, families like the Veales always deploy the matriarch to manipulate the back channels. Lenora Veale did not believe in sending legal letters or begging for private meetings. She operated entirely in the shadows, leveraging a lifetime of country club whispers, philanthropic board connections, and old-world societal debts. By noon, 3 different senior partners on our internal investment committee had forwarded me voicemails they had received from Lenora. She was aggressively lobbying the upper echelons of Bramwell Thorne Capital. In her perfectly modulated, aristocratic voice, she described me as being dramatically unsuited for the high-pressure environment of corporate acquisitions. She framed the catastrophic gala as a minor clash of personalities. She told my bosses that I was overly sensitive, holding a personal grudge, and fundamentally incapable of understanding the nuanced legacy of a historic family culture. She wanted our board of directors to forcefully override my authority. She was trying to paint me as a hysterical, rogue employee determined to destroy a historic financial milestone over a dry cleaning bill. But the most fatal, irreversible error came directly from Celeste herself. Arrogance always breeds a very specific, lethal kind of stupidity. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my encrypted terminal pinged with a secure message originating from an unknown, external address. It was sent by a junior associate working inside the Veale Public Relations Department. The young woman was terrified of being implicated in federal fraud, and she was seeking whistleblower protection. She attached a furious, time-stamped internal email chain that had been initiated by Celeste at 3 o'clock in the morning. In the deeply incriminating thread, Celeste was viciously ordering the communications department to acquire all the smartphone footage taken by the guests at the gala. She demanded the video team utilize advanced editing software to digitally alter the camera angles, splice the frame rates, and artificially manufacture a visual narrative where she appeared to trip on the heavy hem of her emerald gown. She was explicitly commanding her employees to doctor digital evidence to make the thrown glass look like a clumsy, unavoidable accident of physics. That email chain was the absolute death knell. It was the smoking gun of a coordinated cover-up. By 3:30, the lead syndicate lenders convened an emergency, mandatory conference call. The senior managing director from our secondary credit facility had caught wind of Lenora's insidious backdoor lobbying. His risk management team had also flagged Adrian's desperate, undocumented push for a quick settlement. Now, with the whistleblower's email chain officially entered into the secure data room, the lenders smelled the unmistakable, metallic scent of a massive structural rot. Innocent corporate officers simply hand over the requested compliance logs and wait calmly for the audit to clear. They do not threaten the lead investigator with personal ruin. They do not lobby the investment board to drop the inquiry, and they absolutely never order their media department to digitally manipulate evidence. This is no longer a localized, isolated incident involving one executive, the credit director announced on the call. His voice crackled with cold, uncompromising authority over the heavy speakerphone in my office. The target company is exhibiting extreme, erratic, and highly coordinated defensive behavior. We are officially expanding the scope of the forensic review. We want a full, microscopic excavation of every single conduct disclosure, every internal complaint, and every private settlement executed by the Veale family over the past 24 months. We will not fund a single dollar until we see the absolute bottom of this. The parameters of the war had completely shifted. The $2.4 billion transaction was no longer suspended because a spoiled heiress threw a glass of wine. It was suspended because every single counterattack the Veale family launched bore the exact, undeniable hallmarks of a corporate power structure violently spinning out of control. They functioned like a localized mafia, entirely unaccustomed to the glaring lights of institutional accountability. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, staring at the doctored video request illuminated on my monitor. I understood a fundamental, unbreakable law of corporate physics that the Veales had entirely missed in their lifetime of privilege. People who are genuinely innocent operate with total transparency. It is only when the closets are overflowing with hidden liabilities that people panic, tamper with witnesses, and try to break the person holding the flashlight. The Veales thought they were ruthlessly fighting back and securing their empire. In reality, every single move they made that morning was just another violent swing of a shovel, digging their own grave deeper and faster than I ever possibly could. The expanded mandate from the lending syndicate granted us absolute, unrestricted access to the deepest, most heavily encrypted servers in the Veale corporate network. Miles Corbett and I essentially moved into a windowless conference room on the 42nd floor of the Bramwell Thorne building. For 3 days, we existed on black coffee and adrenaline, tearing through the digital wreckage of their empire. The deeper we dug into the bedrock of their operations, the more the polished facade of the logistics giant crumbled into a staggering display of financial rot. It started with the family trust documents. I was tracing the voting rights architecture when I noticed a highly unusual encumbrance attached to the primary block of founder shares. I pulled the master ledger and cross-referenced the serial numbers with the secured debt filings. The blood completely drained from my face when the math finally clicked into place. The Veale family had not just been riding the success of their public company, they had been treating it like a personal casino. "Miles, look at this collateral schedule," I said, pointing at the glowing monitor. The family trust secretly pledged over 40% of their controlling equity as collateral for a massive, short-term personal loan. We are talking about an off-books credit facility worth roughly $400 million. Miles leaned over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the dense columns of legal jargon. The silence in the room grew heavy as the gravity of the situation settled over us. "Look at the maturity date," Miles said. his voice a low, hard whisper. The note comes due in exactly 14 days. Suddenly, the manic, desperate behavior of Adrian and Celeste made perfect, terrifying sense. This merger was never about expanding their corporate footprint in the South. The $2.4 billion acquisition was an emergency blood transfusion. If we did not close this deal, the target company's stock price would inevitably crater on the open market. That drop in valuation would instantly trigger a devastating margin call from their private creditors. The Veales would be forced to surrender their pledged shares. They would not just lose a fortune, they would permanently lose voting control of the empire their grandfather built. They were days away from total annihilation, and they needed our cash to artificially inflate their stock and survive the margin call. But the desperation went far beyond a reckless personal loan. The expanded audit forced their legal team to finally unseal the restricted financial ledgers, giving me a direct line of sight into the suspicious $3.5 million marketing expenditure I had flagged weeks ago. I ran the routing numbers of the opaque brand consulting firm through our federal tracking software. It took less than an hour to peel back the layers of the Delaware Shell Corporation. The registered agent was a proxy. The holding company was a ghost, but the ultimate beneficial owner, the person quietly collecting the massive fee for absolutely zero rendered services, was Brent Veale. He was Adrian and Celeste's cousin, a man who possessed no official role in the company. Celeste had personally signed the authorization wiring millions of dollars of public shareholder money directly into her cousin's pocket. It was not mismanagement, it was textbook corporate embezzlement. The discoveries began to compound, each revelation vastly more damaging than the last. With the syndicate's mandate backing me, I forced the Veale Human Resources Department to decrypt the 2 ghost files marked as resolved privately. When the encrypted documents finally opened on my screen, the true ugly nature of Celeste Veale was permanently documented in black and white. The files were comprehensive legal settlements pertaining to 2 former senior female executives. I read through the sworn affidavits attached to the non-disclosure agreements. Both women detailed horrific, prolonged campaigns of workplace harassment orchestrated entirely by Celeste. The second file contained a chilling echo of my own experience. During a high-profile client retreat in Aspen, Celeste had publicly degraded a female vice president of sales, throwing a cocktail on her dress in front of their top regional distributors simply because the woman had interrupted her during a dinner toast. The company had quietly paid out millions in hush money to bury the incidents and force the women into silence. "These settlements are catastrophic," Miles said, pacing the length of the conference room. "But the behavior itself is not the kill shot. The kill shot is the omission." He was exactly right. In a federal merger of this magnitude, the seller is legally obligated to disclose any material settlements, pending litigation, or internal governance risks to the buyer on a master disclosure schedule. The Veales had intentionally scrubbed these 2 harassment settlements from the final closing documents. They actively conspired to hide a massive, systemic liability from our underwriting team. It was no longer a question of poor conduct, it was a direct, actionable case of securities fraud. The only remaining question was how much the chief executive officer actually knew. Adrian had spent the entire negotiation process playing the role of the beleaguered, innocent peacemaker, pretending his sister was simply an eccentric distraction he could not control. I ran a targeted keyword search through the archived executive server logs, bypassing the sanitized corporate inbox and pulling directly from the internal legal server. I found a highly restricted email thread dated 8 months prior. The general counsel of the company had explicitly briefed Adrian on the severe liability Celeste posed, detailing the exact terms of the Aspen settlement. Adrian had read the entire report. He knew exactly how volatile and dangerous his sister was. Yet, his response to the general counsel was a single, dismissive sentence ordering legal to pay the settlement and close the file. Worse, just weeks after reading that report, Adrian actively chose to put Celeste on the roadshow, allowing her to serve as the primary public face of the company while soliciting our $2.4 billion investment. He did not just enable her toxicity, he aggressively weaponized it to secure the merger. I sat back in the chair, rubbing my tired eyes as the blue light of the monitor cast long shadows across the empty conference room. The puzzle was finally complete, and the picture it formed was breathtaking in its arrogance. I finally understood the true dynamic of the battlefield. When Celeste threw that wine on me, and when Adrian furiously demanded I drop the investigation, they were not fighting to protect their bruised egos. They were absolutely terrified. They were terrified because they knew I was standing directly on top of a trapdoor. They knew that if I refused to sign that integrity certification, the resulting investigation would pry that door open, exposing the margin loans, the embezzlement, the hidden settlements, and the staggering securities fraud rotting beneath the floorboards. This was the profound, electric thrill of a true corporate reckoning. My personal revenge for a ruined suit and a public humiliation had entirely evaporated, replaced by something infinitely more powerful. I was no longer just a wronged executive demanding an apology. I was the architect of their complete financial ruin. The Veales had built an empire on lies, intimidation, and stolen money, and they had handed me the exact blueprint needed to tear it down to the studs. The corporate autopsy we were conducting on the 42nd floor was entirely reliant on digital ghosts' deleted emails, buried wire transfers, and encrypted human resources settlements. But algorithms and ledger audits can only tell you what happened. They cannot tell you how it felt inside the burning house, and they cannot testify to the exact intent of the arsonists. For that, you need a human being who finally decides they have nothing left to lose. On the fourth morning of the expanded review, an independent employment attorney based in New York formally contacted Miles Corbett. He represented a whistleblower seeking federal immunity and absolute confidentiality before she handed over a cache of stolen internal documents. Her name was Naomi Briggs. She was the executive assistant who had abruptly abandoned her post at the Veale corporate headquarters just weeks before the transaction was scheduled to close. I sat next to Miles in our secure conference room as he initiated the encrypted video conference. Naomi appeared on the large wall monitor, sitting in her lawyer's stark white office. She looked exhausted, her posture tight with residual anxiety, but her eyes held the hard, unmistakable clarity of someone who had finally stopped running. I did not leave because I was incompetent, and I did not leave because I found a better job, Naomi stated, her voice trembling slightly before finding its anchor. I left because my entire job description had devolved into cleaning up the toxic garbage the Veale family left behind. I was tired of lying to the shareholders. I was tired of managing the hush money. And when I saw what they were planning to do to you at the gala, Harper, I realized they were never going to stop. I realized they genuinely believed they owned reality. Through her attorney's secure portal, Naomi transferred a massive, unredacted file dump directly onto our isolated server. It was not just corporate correspondence. It was the raw, unfiltered internal dialogue of a family operating a multi-billion-dollar enterprise like a private mafia. The first file I opened completely recontextualized the entire night of the gala. It was a series of high-resolution screenshots capturing private text messages exchanged between Celeste and Lenora Veale, dated just 48 hours before the event in Charlotte. I read the messages in absolute silence, my blood turning to ice. Lenora had initiated the thread, furious over the strict governance disclosure language I had forced into the final drafts. She told her daughter that the firm was letting an arrogant middle management auditor dictate terms to a legacy family. Celeste's reply was permanently burned into the pixels on my screen. "Do not worry about the compliance officer," Celeste had written. "She forgot who actually writes the checks in this industry. I'm going to put her exactly in her place on Friday night. By the time the limited partners see her, she will be too humiliated to say a single word about our internal governance." It was a staggering revelation. The spilled wine was not a sudden burst of drunken emotion. It was not a tragic miscalculation of social boundaries. It was a premeditated, highly orchestrated execution. Naomi had also provided the original, unedited digital seating chart for the ballroom. The metadata proved that just 3 hours before the doors opened, Celeste had personally logged into the event management software. She manually altered the standing arrangements, specifically positioning my assigned high-top table directly in the primary walking path of the lead lenders and the mezzanine partners. She had intentionally dragged the stage props into place to ensure maximum visibility for her strike. She wanted the people who controlled the $2.4 billion to watch her assert absolute physical dominance over the woman demanding legal compliance. "She wanted to break you in front of the Capitol," Miles whispered, staring at the seating chart with open disgust. "She thought if she made you look small enough, the banking syndicate would simply ignore your authority." The maliciousness of the assault was breathtaking. But in the realm of federal securities law, being a terrible person is not inherently a crime. Extortion, however, absolutely is. I opened the next folder Naomi had provided. It contained a chain of internal emails routed through a private, non-corporate server. Celeste had been aggressively demanding a massive, unauthorized payout from her brother, contingent entirely on the successful closing of our acquisition. Because she held no legal executive title, a standard cash bonus would trigger an immediate internal audit to circumvent the law. Celeste had instructed their external legal counsel to draft a fraudulent contract. It was formatted as a $5 million brand alignment success fee, payable to a holding company she secretly controlled. She was effectively taxing the public shareholders for a merger she had almost destroyed, using her brother's desperation as leverage. And Adrian, terrified of his sister's chaotic influence, had authorized the shadow contract just days before the gala. But the final piece of evidence Naomi delivered was the one that officially moved the Veale family from the realm of civil liability into the crosshairs of a federal criminal indictment. According to Naomi's sworn testimony, total panic had consumed the executive floor the moment my automated hold notice hit Adrian's inbox on the night of the gala. While Celeste was busy posting her arrogant photograph to social media, her cousin Brent Veale was sprinting toward the server room. Naomi had retained the emergency maintenance logs. Brent had explicitly ordered the senior information technology director to immediately access the restricted data room. He demanded they digitally scrub the timestamps on the 2 buried harassment settlements and retroactively insert them into an older, previously approved disclosure folder. He wanted to manufacture a false digital trail, proving the Veale family had transparently disclosed the liabilities months ago, making my conduct hold look like a catastrophic, uninformed error. Tampering with official corporate records during an active financial audit is the ultimate sin in institutional finance. It is the exact threshold where investors completely abandon a deal. You can survive a bad quarter. You can sometimes survive a terrible executive. You can never survive a management team that actively alters the truth. Because once the integrity of the data room is compromised, the entire valuation of the company becomes a worthless fiction. Brent Veale actually thought the information technology department could just change the time on a synchronized federal server without triggering a master security log, I said, shaking my head at the profound, catastrophic stupidity of inherited wealth. They are so accustomed to rewriting the rules in their private lives that they forgot they are operating inside a highly monitored federal grid. Naomi's testimony provided the mortar needed to bind all our scattered bricks of evidence into an impenetrable fortress. But I did not immediately forward the whistleblower files to the lending syndicate. I did not rush to the press, and I did not send a triumphant email to Adrian Veale. Revenge, when executed properly in the corporate theater, requires absolute, chilling patience. If you strike too early, or with unorganized fury, you give high-priced defense attorneys room to create reasonable doubt. You give them space to claim the whistleblower is a disgruntled employee fabricating evidence for a payout. Instead, Miles and I locked the door to the conference room and began constructing the master timeline. We used a massive digital whiteboard, plotting every single event down to the exact minute. We started with the earliest email demanding the illegal success fee. We mapped the exact hour Celeste ordered the seating chart altered. We logged the exact second the red wine hit my jacket, cross-referencing it with the timestamp of her premeditated text messages. We plotted the moment I triggered the conduct hold, followed instantly by the digital footprint of Brent Veale attempting to hack his own corporate data room. We built an indestructible chronological matrix of fraud, intimidation, and gross executive incompetence. We wove the human malice Naomi exposed directly into the hard, undeniable forensic data we had extracted from the servers. When we were finished, the timeline stretched across the entire length of the digital board. It was a beautiful, terrifying work of corporate destruction. There was no room left for Adrian to claim ignorance. There was no space for Lenora to blame a clash of personalities. There was absolutely no avenue for Celeste to pretend her actions were a clumsy accident. They had left a blindingly bright trail of evidence precisely because they believed their money and their family name made them invisible to consequences. They thought their power could extinguish any fire they started. They did not realize I had spent the last 90 days quietly soaking their entire empire in gasoline, and they had just handed me the match. The pressure inside Bramwell Thorne was reaching a critical boiling point. Adrian Veale was a survivor, and survivors in the corporate ecosystem know exactly when to sever a limb to save the main body. On Tuesday morning, his high-priced crisis management team delivered a massive, formally bound governance restructuring proposal directly to our investment committee. It was a desperate, brilliantly staged surrender. Adrian was offering a complete purge of his own bloodline to save the acquisition. According to his proposal, Celeste would immediately step down from all public-facing roles, forfeit her media operational budget, and surrender her board observer rights. Brent would be permanently excised from the family office. His shadow contracts voided immediately. Even Lenora, the untouchable matriarch, would formally resign her emeritus status on the Strategic Advisory Board. The sheer magnitude of the concession sent shockwaves through our internal ranks. I sat in the glass-walled boardroom, listening to our senior partners debate the merits of the rescue package. Greed is a powerful, blinding narcotic. Several members of the investment committee began to openly waver. The underlying logistics network the Veales owned was still a massively profitable, highly strategic asset. The projected returns on the merger were staggering, and Wall Street is fundamentally designed to prioritize profit over morality. "We are not the ethics police," one of the senior managing directors argued, tapping his gold pen against the heavy mahogany table. If Adrian is willing to officially quarantine his toxic family members and submit to an independent governance monitor, we salvage the asset. We are here to generate yield, not to punish rich people for terrible family drama. The market will forget about a spilled drink in a week. He was not entirely wrong. If the battlefield had remained confined to a humiliated executive, a ruined designer suit, and a stupid social media post, the Veale family might have actually survived. Corporate America has a long, documented history of forgiving sociopathic behavior if the quarterly earnings are high enough. A beautifully orchestrated apology tour, combined with the sacrifice of a few high-profile chess pieces, could easily give the banking syndicate the plausible deniability they needed to turn the money back on. I sat perfectly still, letting the senior partners talk themselves into a compromise. I knew something they did not. The heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. Miles Corbett walked in, followed closely by the lead partner of the independent forensic cybersecurity firm we had retained over the weekend. They did not look like men who were ready to accept a compromise. Miles plugged his encrypted tablet directly into the central display screen. The faces of the investment committee members turned toward the glowing monitor. "Adrian Veale's restructuring proposal is completely irrelevant," Miles announced, his voice slicing through the thick air of the room. "We are no longer dealing with an arrogant family creating a hostile environment. We are dealing with an active, coordinated, and highly illegal manipulation of a federal financial audit." The cybersecurity partner took the floor. He brought up a complex digital schematic of the virtual data room, the highly secured cloud server, where all the legally binding documents for the $2.4 billion transaction were housed. Based on the whistleblower testimony, we conducted a granular, bit-by-bit forensic sweep of the server access logs, the expert explained. We discovered a catastrophic breach of the platform's integrity. Someone with high-level administrative clearance bypassed the standard security protocols and illegally accessed a restricted folder after the compliance hold was officially activated. He clicked a button, and two side-by-side documents appeared on the screen. They were both labeled as official board of directors meeting minutes from 11 months prior. The document on the left is the original file we pulled from the encrypted backup server. The expert continued. The document on the right is the version currently sitting in the live data room. They look identical, but they are not. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the highlighted paragraphs. The fabricated version of the board minutes had been masterfully altered. 3 entirely new paragraphs had been seamlessly inserted into the text. These new paragraphs explicitly detailed the private harassment settlements and formally authorized the fraudulent brand success fee for Celeste. It was a breathtakingly audacious digital forgery. The Veales had broken into their own financial records to plant fake evidence. They were trying to manufacture a retroactive paper trail to make it look as though they had transparently disclosed all their toxic liabilities months ago. The goal was obvious. If the documents were in the data room, they could accuse me of gross negligence for failing to read them, thereby invalidating my conduct hold and forcing the banks to release the frozen funds. Who uploaded the forged document? The senior managing director asked, his face draining of all color, the prospect of a salvaged deal vanishing from his eyes. The digital signature attached to the upload belongs to an information technology assistant directly managed by Brent Veale. Miles answered, stepping back into the center of the room. But here's the truly damning part. We pulled the cellular tower data and the internal server clocks. We know exactly when the upload occurred. The forged file was pushed into the data room exactly 47 minutes after Harper sent the official conduct hold email to Adrian Veale on the night of the gala. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and incredibly heavy. The narrative had just violently shifted. Adrian had spent the last 4 days aggressively denying any knowledge of his family's chaotic actions. He claimed he could not control his sister. He claimed his cousin acted independently, but the forensic timeline completely destroyed his carefully constructed defense of ignorance. Later that afternoon, Miles and I initiated a mandatory recorded video conference with Adrian and his elite defense counsel. We laid the forensic proof directly on the digital table, watching the reality of the situation crash over them in real time. I did not authorize a server breach, Adrian stated, his voice tight, his eyes darting toward his lawyers off-screen. If my cousin panicked and pressured an information technology employee to alter a document, he acted entirely as a rogue agent. You cannot hold the entire parent company responsible for the panicked actions of one man trying to save his job. Do not insult our intelligence, Adrian, I replied, my tone radiating a cold, surgical precision. You expect us to believe in a miraculous coincidence. You expect us to believe that within 1 hour of receiving my hold notice, your sister went on the offensive, your cousin hacked a federal server, your mother began lobbying our board, and your private lawyers drafted a threat letter against me. And you want us to believe none of you spoke to each other. I paused, leaning closer to the camera lens, letting the crushing weight of the accusations settle over the line. You cannot explain why your sister, your cousin, your legal team, and your technology staff all ran in the exact same direction, executing a highly coordinated cover-up in the middle of the night. Rogue agents do not build a synchronized defense. A corrupted system does. Adrian stared back at me through the high-definition camera. The slick, polished veneer of the untouchable chief executive officer was completely gone. He looked entirely hollowed out. He finally understood that his carefully crafted rescue package was completely useless. You cannot negotiate a peace treaty when the other side has absolute, undeniable proof that your leadership has corrupted the entire process. This is the brutal, deeply satisfying justice of the American corporate revenge story. Nobody loses a $2.4 billion empire simply because a spoiled woman threw a glass of wine at a gala. The capital markets are far too greedy to care about spilled drinks. They lose it because they genuinely believed their wealth and their bloodline made them omnipotent. They believed they were so inherently powerful that they could simply erase their mistakes, rewrite reality, and force the world to accept their forged version of the truth. They thought they were spinning the situation, but in reality, every desperate lie, every altered document, and every arrogant counterattack was just another loop of rope they willingly wrapped around their own necks. And I was simply the one standing quietly on the platform, waiting for them to run out of slack. The final emergency summit convened inside the glass-walled executive boardroom on the 45th floor, exactly 24 hours before the mandatory syndicate vote. The air in the room was incredibly thin. We were standing on the absolute precipice of either salvaging a historic merger or watching $2.4 billion vaporize into the Manhattan skyline. When Adrian Veale walked through the heavy double doors, he was fundamentally unrecognizable. The slick, untouchable armor of the corporate aristocrat had been completely stripped away. His tailored suit hung slightly loose on his frame. The dark circles under his eyes were deep and bruised, the physical manifestation of a man who had spent the last 5 days staring directly into the abyss of personal and financial ruin. He did not take his usual seat at the head of the mahogany table. He stood near the center, gripping the back of a leather chair, and he looked directly at me. "Harper," Adrian began, his voice raspy and entirely stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "Before we discuss the financial architecture of the rescue package, I need to address you directly. I am deeply, profoundly sorry. I was arrogant. I allowed a culture of entitlement to fester under my watch, and I stood by while you were subjected to an inexcusable humiliation. You were entirely right to pull the emergency brake. I should have done it myself years ago." It was a masterful performance. It was the exact kind of vulnerable, modern executive contrition that Wall Street absolutely loves to reward. He sounded like a man who had been broken by his own hubris and was begging for redemption. He then turned to the investment committee and laid out his final, desperate offering. "We are prepared to execute a legally binding, irrevocable governance overhaul," Adrian announced, his hands trembling slightly as he distributed the thick-bound folios. "Celeste will immediately surrender all voting rights connected to the family trust for a minimum of 18 months. We will hire an external, independent oversight committee, chosen entirely by Bramwell Thorne, to monitor every single executive decision. Furthermore, to compensate for the reputational risk and the friction we have caused, the Veale family is willing to voluntarily reduce the final acquisition valuation by $150 million. The collective shift in the room was instantaneous and nauseatingly predictable. I watched the senior managing directors and the limited partners exchange rapid, calculated glances. $150 million in free equity is a staggering concession. In the cold, mathematical reality of institutional finance, moral outrage has a very specific price tag, and Adrian had just met it. The underlying transport technology network they owned was still a generational asset. The projected quarterly yields were astronomical. The bankers did not want to kill a golden goose just because the farmer was corrupt. They wanted to punish the farmer, take a massive discount, and keep the eggs. "This is a highly substantial concession," Adrian, the lead syndicate manager, murmured, leaning back in his chair and tapping his gold pen. "An 18-month voting suspension completely neutralizes the shadow governance issue. With the independent monitor in place, the capital feels significantly insulated from the family dynamics." They were leaning heavily toward a yes. They were actively talking themselves into looking the other way. To seal the narrative, Adrian slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It was a formal, written apology from Celeste. I opened it slowly. The heavy cardstock was embossed with her personal monogram. I read the short, typed paragraph in silence. "I deeply regret any distraction my actions at the gala may have caused the financing team. I understand the necessity of strict operational standards and remain fully committed to the long-term success of the newly merged entity." It was perfectly sanitized. It was entirely devoid of actual human remorse. She did not apologize for the assault. She apologized for the distraction. The language was cold, legally vetted, and highly calculated. It was the letter of a woman who was temporarily accepting a timeout, so she could quietly re-enter the playground the moment the bankers stopped watching. I did not react, I did not sneer, and I did not argue. I simply placed the cream-colored paper face down on the mahogany table. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the greedy optimism of the investment board to reach its absolute peak. I let Adrian believe, for 3 agonizingly long minutes, that he had successfully bought his way out of the grave. Then, I looked across the table at Miles Corbett and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. "The financial concessions are certainly aggressive, Adrian," Miles said, his deep voice cutting through the rising murmur of the room. "But they operate on the assumption that your family understands the fundamental boundaries of corporate law, an assumption we can no longer support." Miles pressed a button on his remote, and the massive digital display screen at the end of the boardroom flared to life. When Harper initiated the conduct hold on the night of the gala, the automated system notified the lead syndicate desk in London to freeze the wire transfers. Miles explained to the room. "What you do not know is what happened exactly 12 minutes after that freeze went into effect." A stark black and white transcript appeared on the screen, accompanied by an audio file icon. By federal banking law, every single phone line connecting to a syndicated lending desk is automatically recorded and permanently archived. This is the verified transcript of a direct call placed to the managing director of the London credit facility at exactly 10:14 in the evening, Miles stated coldly. I watched Adrian's face turn the color of wet ash. He had no idea this existed. Miles hit play. The audio was slightly grainy, carrying the hollow echo of an international connection, but the voice was unmistakably clear, dripping with absolute, unhinged authority. "This is Celeste Veale." The recorded voice echoed through the silent boardroom. "I understand there is a temporary system hold placed by your compliance officer. You are going to manually override that hold immediately and process the wire scheduled for 7 in the morning. Real power does not lie with the final signatory. It lies with the people who own the asset. Process the wire, or we will strip you from the debt syndicate entirely." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the investment committee. The senior managing directors stared at the speakers in absolute disbelief. This was no longer about a spilled glass of wine. It was no longer a human resources nightmare or a toxic workplace environment. This was a catastrophic, documented instance of attempted process interference. A woman with absolutely zero legal or fiduciary authority had directly contacted a federally regulated banking desk and attempted to blackmail them into illegally releasing $2.4 billion by bypassing a mandatory compliance mechanism. "She threatened the lead debt provider," one of our senior partners whispered, running a hand over his face. "She actually tried to strong-arm the bank." "It gets much worse," I said, finally breaking my silence. My voice was quiet, but it carried the finality of a closing door. I stood up and approached the digital screen. "Celeste placed that call demanding the wire transfer at exactly 10:14, I said, pointing to the timestamp on the audio transcript. When the London desk refused her illegal demand, she realized she could not bully the bank. So, her cousin moved to Plan B. I tapped the screen, bringing up the forensic cybersecurity logs we had extracted from the data room. At exactly 10:26, merely 12 minutes after Celeste hung up the phone with London, Brent Veale's information technology assistant illegally breached the restricted corporate data room. I explained, tracking the digital timeline with my finger. That is the exact moment the forged board minutes were uploaded to the server in a desperate attempt to legitimize the hidden liabilities. The sheer scale of the delusion finally crushed the oxygen out of the room. The puzzle pieces locked together with an audible, terrifying click. Adrian stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes completely hollow. He could not blame this on a rogue employee. He could not pass this off as a singular moment of panic. The timeline was far too tight. It was a synchronized, multi-pronged attack on the integrity of the transaction. Celeste tried to extort the money through the front door, and when that failed, Brent tried to forge the legal justification through the back door. The investment committee members who had been nodding eagerly just 5 minutes ago were now physically leaning away from Adrian, as if proximity to him might result in a federal indictment. An 18-month voting suspension does not cure this, the lead syndicate manager said, his voice hard and entirely devoid of the warmth it held moments before. A discount on the purchase price does not cure this. You cannot put an independent monitor in a room with a family that actively attempts to subvert the banking system the second they do not get their way. They do not understand the difference between social influence and legal authority. They think the law is just a suggestion for poor people. The deal was completely, irreversibly dead. I looked at Adrian. All the practiced contrition, all the desperate maneuvering, and all the generational arrogance had finally collapsed under the unforgiving weight of a digital timestamp. They had come incredibly close to surviving. They had almost bought their salvation, but in the end, their absolute refusal to believe that the rules applied to them had been the exact weapon that executed their empire. The final vote took place in a hermetically sealed executive conference room on the 45th floor. There were no public relations handlers allowed inside. There were no junior associates to fetch coffee. The only people sitting around that vast expanse of polished mahogany were the true apex predators of the transaction. The investment committee, the senior transaction attorneys, the lead representatives from the lending syndicate, Adrian Veale, and myself. The air filtration system hummed softly, a sterile soundtrack to an execution. I did not deliver a grand, impassioned speech. I did not raise my voice, and I did not demand apologies. I simply acted as the cold narrator of their demise. I stood at the head of the table and walked the committee through the master timeline we had built. I laid out the sequence of events with surgical precision. I started with the premeditated text messages. I moved to the intentional alteration of the seating chart. I noted the exact minute the red wine hit my jacket. I displayed the arrogant social media post uploaded mere minutes later. I presented the threatening cease and desist letter delivered at dawn. I tracked the matriarch's desperate back-channel lobbying. Then, I drove the final nails into the coffin. I presented the exact timestamp of the illegal data room breach, directly followed by the audio transcript of Celeste attempting to extort the London credit desk. I laid the entire anatomy of a corporate cover-up bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. Then, I sat down and folded my hands. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. The senior managing director of the primary credit fund slowly took off his reading glasses and tossed them onto the table. He looked directly at Adrian. "If we wire this money tomorrow morning, we are not buying a logistics company," the director said, his voice completely devoid of any previous warmth. "We are buying a governance time bomb. And I absolutely refuse to let my capital be the collateral damage when it finally detonates." Adrian realized the floor was vanishing beneath his feet. He lunged for one final, desperate lifeline. He stood up, placing both hands flat on the table, his knuckles turning entirely white. "I will remove her completely," Adrian pleaded, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of the room. "I will legally sever Celeste from every single trust vehicle. I will accept severe, post-closing punitive covenants. You can write any financial penalty you want into the operating agreement. Just do not kill this merger. The underlying asset is too valuable to abandon over a family dispute." It was a pathetic, agonizing display, but it was entirely too late. In the high-stakes ecosystem of institutional finance, you can negotiate price, you can negotiate timelines, and you can even negotiate market risk. The one thing you can never negotiate is structural trust. Once the foundational integrity of the management team is proven to be compromised, the entire architecture collapses. The lead partner of Bramwell Thorne Capital called for the official vote. It was not even a debate. It was a swift, brutal, and unanimous slaughter. Every single managing director raised their hand to terminate the funding. The $2.4 billion transaction was officially terminated, dying just inches from the finish line. The legal team sitting along the back wall immediately began drafting the formal termination notices. The exclusive negotiation window was instantly revoked, and the right of first refusal automatically shifted to a massive, waiting competitor who had been circling the asset for months. The competitor swooped in within 48 hours, purchasing the technology network at a premium, leaving the Veale Corporation entirely out in the cold. When the acquisition officially died, the shockwave completely leveled the Veale family empire. The immediate fallout was far more violent than I could have ever anticipated. The failure of the merger sent the target company's stock price into a catastrophic, uncontrolled freefall the moment the financial markets opened the following morning. That sudden violent depreciation instantly triggered the cross-default clauses buried deep within the family trust's private debt structure. The massive, short-term personal loan they had desperately tried to hide was immediately called in by their private creditors. The Veales did not have the liquid cash to cover the margin call. To avoid total bankruptcy, the family was forced to initiate a humiliating fire sale. They had to liquidate a massive portion of their controlling founder shares just to satisfy the outstanding debt. In a matter of days, they permanently lost their voting majority. They no longer owned the company their grandfather built. They were merely minority shareholders trapped in a sinking ship. The internal bloodletting was absolute. Celeste was completely stripped of every public-facing role, permanently exiled from the philanthropic boards she had used to build her high society identity. Without the corporate credit card and the artificial title, her social gravity vanished overnight. Brent was forcefully ousted from the family office, facing potential federal inquiries into his shadow contracts. Lenora Veale was entirely sidelined, her emeritus status revoked, leaving her with no strategic voice and no audience for her aristocratic demands. Adrian managed to survive the massacre and retain his title as the chief executive officer, but it was a completely hollow victory. He was no longer a king. He was a captive, heavily monitored administrator, answering daily to a hostile board of directors who viewed him with open contempt. He was left to rule over the smoking ashes of an empire he was too weak to protect. I did not celebrate loudly. I did not post a triumphant message on social media, and I did not send a gloating email to the executives I had just destroyed. In my world, true power is silent. I walked out of that glass-walled boardroom, returned to my quiet office overlooking the Manhattan grid, and drafted the final transaction post-mortem report. I filed the paperwork, locked my terminal, and went home. 2 weeks later, the managing partners of Bramwell Thorne formally pulled me into a closed-door meeting. They did not reprimand me for losing a massive deal. Instead, they offered me a highly coveted spot on the senior partner track. They understood that I had taken the hit to protect the fund, executing my duty perfectly when a lesser executive might have chosen to remain quiet just to keep the peace. The Veale family did not lose $2.4 billion because I had a glass of cheap red wine poured on my tailored suit. They lost it at the exact second they believed they could humiliate the right person and face absolutely no consequences. They were blinded by generations of unchecked privilege, convinced that their wealth made them immune to the mechanics of reality. In the ruthless, unforgiving world of absolute power, the most dangerous person is never the one screaming the loudest in the middle of the room. The most dangerous person is the one who understands exactly when to step back, remain perfectly still, and let the system speak for them. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, like this video, and share it so more people can hear the story.